The storm corridors of Nerth-Nine moaned like metal throats, swallowing wind, as Tyler Darren stepped out of the transit annex. The artificial rain falling in vicious diagonal lines that blurred every surface into trembling silver. His jacket hung heavy on his shoulders, soaked from the earlier shift, and fatigue clung to him like a second skin. A reminder of the long hours he'd spent rerouting trams through storm surges and damaged lines. When his umbrella snapped first one rib, then another, the fabric tearing open under a violent gust, he barely reacted. He folded the ruined thing once, shoved it into an overflowing bin, and walked on, silently accepting the small failure as just another piece of the world slipping beyond his control. The discarded umbrella felt like a metaphor he didn't want to examine too closely. Broken. No longer useful. Forgotten without ceremony. Much like parts of himself, he had stopped trying to fix after leaving the border forces. By the time the annex called him back for an unplanned overtime block, the storm had intensified from harsh to punishing. The amber lights on the storm board deepened toward orange, the colony's version of a raised voice. Tyler worked until the noise in his mind cleared and only decisions remained. But when he finally signed out for good, and the doors opened to the storm again, something in the air felt different, not physically, but like an ache behind the ribs that warned of something waiting ahead. He walked his usual route home, boots steady on slick metal, passing shuttered stalls, closed vents, and the faint smell of broth leaking from a noodle stand that had long since powered down. Each step echoed with the rhythm of habit until he rounded a bend and the world shifted in one precise, irreversible instant. At first, he saw only a shape on the ground, small, hunched, unmoving beneath the heavy rainfall pooling along the walkway edges. Then the storm lights flickered, and the details sharpened. A woman, alien. Her skin a muted violet washed pale under the cold glow. Kneeling with her bare feet pressed into the freezing metal. Her shoulders shaking as rain soaked through the torn scraps wrapped around her body. In her arms lay an infant wrapped in a faded cloth so worn the pattern was barely visible. And above the child, angled desperately despite its useless state, was the broken umbrella he himself had thrown away earlier, its fractured frame trembling each time the wind struck. The sight hit him with a force he hadn't felt since his combat years. A clean, immediate impact that bypassed thought. She clutched the umbrella like it was the last fragile barrier between life and the storm, shielding the baby with her own body, her back taking the full assault of wind and freezing rain. Her shaking intensified each time the baby whimpered, as if each small sound cracked something inside her. Tyler stopped breathing for a heartbeat. Then he moved. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the slow, deliberate pace of someone approaching a wounded animal. She flinched at the sound of his boots on the wet metal. Her arms tightened, her posture curling protectively around the child. Her voice came out thin, hoarse, frightened. "Don't touch. No, take him." The words were broken, but clear enough, forged from terror and exhaustion. Tyler lifted both hands, palms open, showing emptiness. "I'm not touching either of you," he said quietly, letting his voice settle low beneath the storm's roar. "I see a mother keeping her child alive. That's all." She didn't believe him, not yet. Her silver eyes darted from his hands to his face to the storm behind him, calculating escape, even though her body was too weak to run. But she didn't scream. She didn't try to crawl away. And that hesitation, that single suspended second, was the sliver of trust he needed. Tyler crouched carefully, lowering himself until he was below her eye level, a posture his training had taught him long ago for moments when fear could turn volatile. Rain slammed into his shoulders, ran down his face, gathered at his collar. He ignored the cold. He focused only on her trembling arms, on the infant's shallow breaths, on the broken umbrella swaying above them like a dying flag of surrender. "You can't stay out here," he said. "You and the baby will freeze." For the first time, her eyes met his directly, full of panic, defiance, and something sharper. The fierce, unbreakable instinct of a mother who had been fighting too long with too little. Tyler felt something old inside him unlock. Something he had shoved down for years under routine, discipline, and exhaustion. Compassion. Not the distant kind he offered through screens and stormboards, but the human kind, the kind that moved his muscles before he realized he'd decided to act. "I'm not here to take him," he repeated. "I'm here because you're both still breathing, and I don't want that to stop." The storm howled around them, water hammering the metal walkway, the colony roaring with mechanical life. But in that narrow slice of space, between a man who had stopped caring and a woman who couldn't afford to, something shifted. Tiny, fragile, real. Sarala didn't lower the umbrella. She didn't uncurl her arms. But she blinked once, slowly, a gesture made heavy by exhaustion. And Tyler recognized it for what it was, the first fragile thread of trust extended across the storm. The moment that would change everything. Tyler moved slowly, careful not to crowd her, as he extended his arm just far enough for her to use as balance if she chose it. And after a trembling hesitation, she rested her fingertips lightly against his forearm, rising unsteadily with the baby clutched to her chest, her bare feet slipping on the wet metal until he shifted his stance to shield her from the wind without touching her. Together, they walked through the storm corridor toward his housing block, each step a negotiation between her fear and her need to keep the child alive. And when the door slid open to release a breath of warm, dry air, she froze at the threshold, as if warmth itself were a trap. But at last she crossed inside, flinching when a neighbor looked at her with suspicion before scurrying away. And Tyler felt a quiet anger coil underneath his fatigue as he guided her into his apartment, a small, clean space whose heater hummed softly and whose neatly ordered shelves revealed a life defined by routine rather than comfort. She stood near the wall, dripping water, her shoulders tight with uncertainty, while the baby whimpered weakly in her arms. And Tyler kept his distance, moving with careful, deliberate motions as he turned up the heater, filled a pot with water, and set it on the cook unit, explaining each step in a calm voice, so she wouldn't think he was hiding any sudden movement. And she watched him with wide, unblinking silver eyes, her posture that of someone who had lived too long in places where help came at a price. When he offered her a towel, she took it slowly, patting her sodden hair, as if unsure she was allowed to use something so soft, then pulled his oversized jacket closer around her thin frame until the trembling in her jaw eased just a fraction. And when he brought her warmed mash for the baby, he set it down within reach, but did not attempt to feed the child himself, honoring her boundaries, earning the first real shift in her expression, a subtle softening, fragile but real, as she dipped her fingers into the mixture and helped the infant latch, her relief visible in the slow, shuddering exhales she released when the baby drank more greedily than before. Tyler stepped back, giving her space, wringing out his soaked shirt and changing into a dry one, the faint scars across his back catching her attention only for a moment before she returned her focus to the child. And when she spoke, her voice was rough, frayed at the edges, but steady enough to reveal pieces of her story, how the lower tiers had collapsed in a lethal surge weeks ago, how shelters refused her without documents, how people looked away when she begged for help, because a crying baby attracted complaints but not compassion. And she had walked upward through cold stairwells until her legs failed and she collapsed under the storm. Tyler listened without interruption, absorbing the way each word was shaped by exhaustion rather than self-pity. And he found himself speaking honestly in return, telling her he had once coordinated rescue teams in storms far harsher than these until one mission went wrong, and lives he'd been responsible for, or lost in a way he could never quite bury, driving him into a quieter job where saving people no longer meant watching them fall. And she studied him with a perceptiveness sharper than he expected, telling him he moved like someone who still expected danger behind every corner. When the baby finished eating and drifted into a deeper sleep, she wrapped him in a warmer cloth Tyler provided and finally allowed her knees to bend as she sank onto the edge of his bed, exhaustion dragging at her limbs, and Tyler placed a folded mat on the floor for himself, assuring her she could sleep without fear because he would not cross her boundaries. And for the first time since he'd met her, she allowed her body to loosen, eyes fluttering shut as her breathing began to slow. Her child nestled safely at her side, while Tyler, sitting in the dim glow of the heater, realized that the night had shifted him in quiet, irreversible ways. A before and after, marked not by storms or missions, but by the presence of a mother and her child who had turned his small, ordered world into something uncertain and undeniably human. Tyler woke before the colony lights shifted to daytime mode, his back stiff from the mat, but his senses sharp, and he found Sarala sitting exactly where she'd fallen asleep, half upright with the baby resting against her chest, her eyes snapping open the moment he moved, as if years of danger had taught her that deep sleep was a luxury she could not afford. She checked the baby first, her fingers brushing his cheek with a gentleness at odds with the rigid tension in her spine, then met Tyler's gaze with a flicker of uncertainty, as though unsure whether the safety of the night still existed, now that morning had arrived. And when he reassured her, she hadn't disturbed him, and that she'd needed the rest. Something inside her softened by a degree, so small, most people would have missed it, that Tyler didn't miss anything anymore. As he reheated a simple meal of grain and broth, she fed the child with the new bottle he'd bought, her movements more coordinated, now that warmth had seeped back into her limbs. And once they'd both eaten, he explained they were going out not far, only to the early market where crowds were thin and attention scarce, because she needed proper clothes, baby supplies, and whatever else would help her survive more than one night. She hesitated, gripping the shirt she wore, as if waiting for him to demand something in exchange. But when he promised again that his help came without price, she tied the baby securely in the cloth sling and followed him into the corridor, flinching only once when a resident passed and stared at her bare legs before looking away in discomfort. The lift carried them down into the wide arteries of the marketeers, where lanterns flickered above rows of stalls and steam rose from pots of broth thick with spices. And Sarala instinctively stepped closer to Tyler when three workers brushed past without apology, muttering about storm refugees under their breath. She tried to shrink into the shadows, but Tyler angled his body so she wouldn't have to, guiding her gently toward a fabric stall where a gray-haired vendor studied Sarala with a measuring gaze that held no cruelty, only assessment. And when Tyler requested a warm wrap skirt, an undershift, and a strong belt for support, the vendor produced garments that looked far too fine for someone who had spent nights sleeping in corridors. Sarala touched the violet skirt with trembling fingers, her voice barely audible when she asked whether it was truly meant for her. And when Tyler nodded, she carried the items to a changing alcove, emerging minutes later transformed, not in beauty, though she was striking even drenched and exhausted, but in presence, her posture straighter, her movements less defensive, as though clothing that actually fit her had stitched back together pieces of identity she feared were lost forever. Tyler paid without hesitation, and they moved deeper into the market, weaving between vendors setting out fresh grain cakes and workers hauling boxes of nutrient packs. But then a group of younger men passed, one glancing at Sarala with a sneer before whispering loudly. Storm Trash found herself a sponsor, and although the insult wasn't directed at her child, it struck her like a blow. Her face went still, her breath caught, Her shoulders pulled inward, and the baby whimpered as if sensing her distress. Tyler stopped so abruptly, the group stumbled, and when he turned, his voice dropped into a controlled, lethal calm that made all three freeze, as he warned them that another word would send them, explaining their behavior to transit security. They backed away quickly, muttering, but Sarala didn't move, her hands rigid on the sling straps, until Tyler stepped back to her side and said quietly, "You're safe. They won't try again." Though she whispered that words hurt worse than hands sometimes, a truth he understood far too well. To give her space to breathe, he led her toward a stall selling child supplies, where an older woman gently fitted a storm-tested wrap sling around Sarala's torso, adjusting the baby into a more secure position that distributed weight evenly. And for the first time, the strain eased from Sarala's arms and shoulders. She blinked, startled by how much easier it felt to stand and walk. And as they continued through the quieter garden corridor, lined with hydroponic plants, she brushed the leaves of one species and murmured that her people had grown the same variety before their region collapsed. Before everything she'd known was washed away by hunger, drought, and political violence she still wouldn't name. When Tyler told her she hadn't failed by arriving here, half-frozen, she'd survived because she kept walking, her steps slowed, and she looked at him with a fragile awareness that perhaps, for the first time in a long time, the world had given her a moment not shaped by cruelty. They stopped at a warm drink kiosk, sipping lightly spiced broth, while she admitted she still had nowhere to go, because shelters required documents she'd never possessed. And Tyler simply told her she could stay with him for now, long enough to stabilize and register for storm relief. She stared at him as if the offer were a language she barely recognized, whispering that he offered too much, and he replied that it wasn't too much, just enough, spoken with such steady conviction that Sarala finally breathed without bracing for what might come next, her fingers curling around her cup as she said in a trembling voice, "Then I will try," and together they walked back toward the lifts, not with her trailing behind him in fear, but beside him, her steps uncertain, but aligned with his too, silhouettes moving through the misting air toward a future neither had expected the night before. Back inside Tyler's apartment, the door sliding shut behind them with a muted hiss that sealed out the noise of the colony. Sarala paused in the center of the room as if crossing that threshold for the second. Time demanded a different kind of strength than surviving the storm, her fingers brushing the edge of the new wrap skirt, as if confirming it hadn't vanished. The baby slept in the upgraded sling, his breath soft against her chest, and Tyler moved quietly around the small space, setting items on shelves, warming food, adjusting the heater, speaking only when necessary so she wouldn't feel crowded. Yet she kept watching him from the corner of her eyes, measuring the consistency of his gentleness in daylight, the same way she'd measured the danger of every stranger she'd ever met. When he placed a fresh bowl of steaming meat and grain before her and told her to eat first, she hesitated, not because she didn't trust the food, but because accepting care felt like stepping onto unsteady ground. Yet the moment the first bite touched her tongue, her shoulders dropped with a soft, unwilling sigh, and Tyler saw something melt inside her that had been frozen far longer than the night storm. As she ate, he prepared a second plate for himself, sitting across from her with quiet patience, not staring, not pressing, simply being present. And for reasons she didn't understand, that steadiness made her chest tighten in ways that frightened and soothed her at the same time. When she finally asked why he lived alone, he answered with the same honesty he'd shown her in the storm, that life had pulled him in a direction where being on call was easier than being expected at home, that the border force missions had broken pieces of him he wasn't sure how to rebuild. And she listened more closely than he expected, her gaze flicking to the faint scars visible beneath the rolled fabric of his sleeve as if reading history from the lines on his skin. She admitted her own past, only in fragments, that she had come from a region where storms weren't engineered but wild, where collapse meant running, where carrying her child up the tears had been an act of desperation rather than hope, and Tyler didn't push for more, merely nodded as though her survival alone was explanation enough. When the baby stirred, she adjusted the sling with practiced care, but her hands trembled faintly, exhaustion creeping back into her bones. And Tyler stepped closer not to touch her, but to steady the bottle so she could rest her fingers. In the moment their hands brushed, the air shifted as if something delicate had snapped free from restraint. She froze, not with fear, but with a startling awareness, her breath catching as her fingers rested against the back of his hand, a heartbeat too long before she pulled away. Mumbling an apology that dissolved the instant he said gently, "You're not in my way." She swallowed, cheeks warming, and after a moment she reached again for the bowl on the counter, this time deliberately stepping close enough that her shoulder grazed his arm. A tiny electric contact she pretended not to notice, but couldn't hide from herself. The room filled with the quiet rhythm of shared tasks, the baby's soft breaths, and the simmering pulse of something awakening between them. And when Tyler turned toward her, she didn't retreat, instead lifting her chin with hesitant courage, as she told him she was trying to understand him, that humans usually avoided her kind, that she couldn't comprehend why he stood so close, without fear or judgment. He answered simply that he wasn't avoiding her, and that truth cracked something inside her defenses, her voice thinning as she admitted she didn't understand the feelings rising in her chest. The warmth that wasn't from the heater, the steadiness she felt near him. He stepped just close enough for her to feel the heat of his body without touching, telling her she didn't have to understand anything today, that she could choose the pace. And her breath trembled as she whispered that standing close to him felt right in a way that terrified her. He didn't move until she did, until she closed the final inch between them, her shoulder pressing against him, her fingers brushing the edge of his shirt, and when she tipped her face upward, eyes filled with fragile determination, she whispered, "Tell me something honest." He didn't hesitate, didn't soften the truth, telling her he wanted her not out of pity or obligation, but because she changed the air in the room simply by breathing in it, because her strength shook him more than any storm, because she looked at him as if he were more than a tired man living in a quiet room. Her breath shuddered, her hand tightened in the fabric of his shirt, and then she pulled him into a kiss, urgent, trembling, full of the emotion she'd held back for years, and he steadied her waist with one careful hand, mindful of the child, matching her intensity with a gentleness that anchored her rather than overtook her. When she finally broke the kiss, leaning her forehead against his chest, she whispered that she wanted more but needed time, and he nodded, promising her that every step would be hers to choose. A promise she believed enough to ask him in a trembling voice to sleep beside her, not for anything more, but simply so she wouldn't face the night alone. And when he agreed, her entire body softened with the first real sense of safety she'd felt since her world had collapsed. Tyler lay beside her that night with a respectful distance between their bodies, the dim heater glow tracing soft amber lines across the room. And Sarawa slept more deeply than he'd seen her sleep since the storm, her breath warm against his shoulder as the baby rested safely in the padded crate nearby. When morning came, and the light shifted pale across the metal ribs of the ceiling, she woke with a small jolt, as if surprised to find him still there. Surprised that nothing had changed, except the quiet certainty settling between them. And when he greeted her with a gentle morning, something soft flickered in her eyes, soft but wary, like a creature learning to trust its first patch of sun. She fed the child with a new bottle, hands steadier, posture calm, and Tyler prepared a simple breakfast, moving around the room with a domestic ease that startled her, because nothing in her life had ever included another person moving in shared rhythm with her. But she watched him with a thoughtful stillness, her gaze drifting from his scars to his hands to the floor, until finally she confessed she'd been feeling sick in the mornings for several days. She said it in fragments, almost embarrassed, one hand drifting unconsciously to her lower stomach, as if trying to hide the possibility growing there. And when Tyler asked gently if she thought she might be pregnant, she did not answer at first. Just breathed through the fear, through the hope, through the ache of uncertainty that tightened her throat. And then she whispered, "Yes, I think so." She waited for him to retreat, to panic, to pull away before the truth could unravel her fragile safety. But he didn't move except to sit closer. Not touching, just closer, steady as bedrock, telling her that if another child was growing inside her, they would face it together. And the relief that crossed her face was so raw and unexpected, she had to look away to keep from sobbing. After a long, trembling minute, she revealed something deeper, something she hadn't dared to speak the night before that on her world. Before everything collapsed, her people practiced a ritual called the bond mark. 2 lines crossed by a third etched on the wrist to show shared burdens and chosen futures. Not marriage, not ownership, but a promise made only between equals. She turned her wrist upward as she described it, tracing invisible lines on her skin with her fingertip, and Tyler took her hand gently, examining the delicate bones beneath her violet skin, as though the gesture itself were sacred, asking where the mark would go if they made it together. She hesitated, searching his face, afraid of what commitment meant, yet wanting it enough that she finally whispered, "Here," pointing to the thin place where her pulse beat softly beneath the skin. Then added that if they did this, it would never be temporary bond marks were for life, weathered through storms, exile, hunger, and death. Tyler didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't step back from the weight of her words. Instead, he lifted her wrist to his lips and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss there, sealing his answer without needing language. And Sarala's breath broke in a shiver of disbelief, as if she had never imagined a future where someone would choose her without fear or condition. She told him, voice soft but steady, that if the child inside her was real, she didn't want to raise it half-hidden, pretending to be unworthy of safety, pretending her life began only with suffering. She wanted a home, a real one, where her children would not be hunted or pitied or thrown from shelters. And Tyler promised she would have that. Not because she owed him anything, but because he wanted to build it with her. The morning air vibrated faintly with the hum of the colony's renewed storm cycle. But inside the small apartment, Tyler cleared a space on the counter for the ritual they would perform at first light, pulling out a small sterile blade and pigment vial from a forgotten emergency kit, laying them out with meticulous care. And when Sarala stepped beside him, sliding her fingers between his with a quiet, trembling breath, he realized the storm outside had nothing on the force of the choice they were making. 2 strangers now bound not by fear, not by circumstance, but by the deliberate act of choosing each other before the next hour of their lives arrived. The colony was still half asleep when Tyler and Sarala prepared the space for the bond mark, the heater's warm hum filling the quiet as pale artificial daylight bled slowly across the walls. And Sarala stood before him with her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, the violet of her skin sharpened by the morning light, her eyes steady but carrying a tremor of something deeper than fear, something like surrender to a life she hadn't dared imagine. Tyler laid out the blade and pigment on a clean cloth, moving with the same calm precision he once used to prep for rescue missions. But this time every motion felt heavier, more intimate. And when he turned to her, she lifted her wrist with a small, deliberate inhale, offering it to him not as a gesture of desperation, but of choice, of willingness, of fragile hope shaped into something brave. He touched her wrist gently, tracing the path the three lines would take, feeling the rapid pulse beneath her skin. And for a moment, the world narrowed to just that heartbeat beating against his fingertips, until Sarala pulled in a shaky breath and whispered, "Before you mark me, you should know why I was really turned away." And Tyler stilled, sensing the fracture point in her voice. She didn't look at him at first, instead fixing her gaze on the baby sleeping peacefully in the nest nearby. And her voice, when it came, was low and weighted with truths she had carried too long alone, as she explained that she wasn't just a migrant from a collapsed region, but one of the last surviving daughters of a protector caste, one her people once called line bearers, individuals trained from childhood to guard sacred genetic archives that rival colonies coveted and feared, and that her child carried markers from that lineage even she did not fully understand. Tyler felt the room tighten around them. The colony's faint mechanical whir suddenly too loud, but he didn't move, didn't speak, letting her unravel the truth. Shelters had not rejected her for lack of documents. They had recognized what she was and refused because taking her in meant becoming entangled in an unspoken political hunt. A hunt still unfolding across the lower tiers as agents searched for rogue genetic carriers whose bloodlines were deemed dangerous to stabilizing power structures. Sarala's voice faltered only once as she admitted she had watched her family scattered or killed, had fled carrying the encoded fragments of a heritage entire systems wanted erased. And when she reached the part about the baby, how some factions believed eliminating children of her caste could prevent future rebellion, her breath buckled, and Tyler stepped closer without thinking, placing his hands on either side of her arms, but not touching, just anchoring the space so she wouldn't collapse under the weight of her confession. She looked up at him then, silver eyes wet, bracing for rejection, bracing for him to recoil, but instead he said, steady and unshaken, "No one touches you. No one touches your children. Not while I'm breathing." And the fierce conviction in his voice cracked something deep inside her, something that had been held together only through desperation and maternal instinct. She whispered, "If you bond with me, you bond with my past and my enemies." But Tyler shook his head, lifting her wrist with deliberate certainty as he answered, "If I bond with you, I bond with your future. The rest we face together." And for the first time since fleeing her home, Sarala closed her eyes not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of finally not standing alone. She held out her wrist fully then, and without hesitation, he drew the three-line mark across her skin, each stroke precise, each line binding their lives not by force, but by shared will. When he offered his wrist, Sarala's hands trembled, but she made the mark on him with the same reverence her ancestors once used in temples, now reduced to ashes. Sealing a vow neither of them spoke aloud, because it already lived in the way they breathed in unison. Outside, the rain softened to a steady whisper, as if even the storm paused to acknowledge the moment forming inside the small apartment. And the baby stirred with a soft murmur, as though sensing the shift in the air. Sarala stepped into Tyler's arms without needing permission, resting her forehead against his chest, her voice barely a thread as she whispered, "Then this is home." And Tyler wrapped her close, the bond mark still fresh on their wrists as a promise that everything coming next, danger, pursuit, life, birth, war, or peace, would be met not by a broken refugee and a tired ex-soldier, but by two people who chose each other across the storm and built something unshakable in its wake.